He married a stranger to end a war. He expected to spend one obligatory night proving the treaty was real and go back to running his world the way he always had. He did not expect to spend that night learning his bride had been taught her whole life that her only worth was in being handed to someone else, and deciding, somewhere around midnight, he refused to be one more man who treated her that way. The reception hall at the Conti estate had been decorated within an inch of its life. White roses, gold linens, a string quartet playing something nobody was actually listening to. 200 guests from two families that had spent 11 years trying to bury each other now stood in the same room, drinking the same champagne, performing the particular brittle civility of people whose mind ordered to make peace and hadn't yet learned to trust it. Matteo Conti stood near the head table, his jaw aching from 6 hours of forced smiles, watching the room the way he watched every room, cataloging exits, counting the men who still looked like they wanted a reason to start something. The treaty had cost both families more than money to reach. It had cost a decade of buried sons and brothers, and tonight's marriage was the only thing either side had agreed could finally close that ledger. "You could try looking less like you're at a funeral," his uncle Salvatore said, peering at his elbow with 2 glasses of scotch, handing one over without asking. "It's your wedding, Matteo. It's a treaty, with a band playing. It's both. That's not a tragedy. It's how it's always been done." Salvatore nodded toward the small cluster of people near the bridal table, where Sofia Ricci stood beside her father, composed, beautiful, dressed in Venetian lace that had clearly cost more than most people's homes. The Ricci girl is well-bred, educated. Her father's kept her close, kept her sharp. She'll understand the arrangement better than you think. These syndicate daughters always do. Matteo studied her from across the room. Sofia held herself with practiced stillness, nodding at the right moments as a stream of well-wishers passed in front of her, her smile fixed in the particular way of someone executing a performance rather than feeling one. He'd assumed, same as Salvatore, that this was simply composure, the bred, cynical competence of a daughter raised inside this world, who understood exactly what tonight meant and had long since made peace with it. It wasn't until the receiving line thinned and she reached for her champagne glass that he saw the crack in it. Her hand was shaking, not a small, nervous flutter, a real, visible tremor. Bad enough that she set the glass down before lifting it to her mouth. Bad enough that she pressed her palm flat against the table afterward, like she was steadying something. Her eyes, when they weren't fixed on whichever guest stood in front of her, moved restlessly toward the room's exits. The same automatic scan he did himself when he walked into anywhere unfamiliar. That wasn't the behavior of someone who understood the arrangement. That was the behavior of someone who was terrified and working very hard not to show it. "Make sure it's done properly tonight," Salvatore said quietly, close to his ear, as the staff and began ushering guests toward the cars that would carry the wedding party to the penthouse for the night. "The old men on both sides will want confirmation the marriage is consummated. It settles the treaty in their eyes, not just on paper. You understand what I'm telling you. I understand exactly what you're telling me. Then don't overthink it. It's one night, Matteo. She's a Ricci. She'll know what's expected." Salvatore clapped him once on the shoulder, the casual confidence of a man passing down an instruction he'd never once questioned in his own life. "Go end the war properly." Matteo didn't answer. He watched Sofia being walked toward the car by her father, watched the old man pause to say something low and private to his daughter, watched Sofia nod with the same fixed, practiced composure she'd worn all evening, and watched, just before she turned away, her father's hand brush her cheek in a gesture that looked less like a blessing and more like a man saying goodbye to something he was about to lose. It stayed with him the whole drive to the penthouse, a small wrongness he couldn't yet name. The penthouse suite smelled like white lilies and floor wax, a particular sterile luxury of a hotel performing romance on command. Matteo dropped the keycard on the marble foyer table and crossed to the window, giving himself a moment before he had to turn around and face the actual evening ahead of him. When he did turn, Sofia was standing exactly where she'd been left, 3 feet inside the door, still in 40 pounds of white silk and Venetian lace, shaking. Not the calculated tremble he'd half expected from a seasoned bride performing nerves for effect. Real, bone-deep, full-body fear, the kind that made her shoulders curl slightly inward, the kind that made her breath come shallow and fast, even though she was trying, visibly, to control it. Mateo set his own jacket over a chair and studied her for a long moment, the unease from the car finally sharpening into something closer to certainty. "Sit down," he said. Not an order. He kept his voice deliberately even, the register he used for spooked horses, for negotiations that had gone sideways and needed careful handling rather than force. "You don't have to keep standing there like you're waiting for a verdict." Sophia blinked, like the gentleness had genuinely surprised her. She sat, carefully, on the edge of a velvet armchair, her hands folded tight in her lap, her eyes fixed somewhere just past his shoulder. "My uncle thinks you're a seasoned syndicate daughter," Mateo said. "Someone who's done the math on this arrangement and made peace with it." He crossed the room slowly, stopping a careful distance away, close enough to talk, far enough not to crowd her. "I don't think that's true. I think you're terrified, and I'd like to understand why, before either of us decides what tonight is supposed to look like." "It doesn't matter what I think tonight is supposed to look like," Sophia said quietly, her voice steadier than her hands. "It's already decided. It was decided before either of us were born, practically. The treaty was decided. The marriage was decided." Mateo sat down across from her, deliberately lowering himself to her eye level rather than standing over her. "What happens in this room tonight is not written into any contract, Sophia. I need you to understand that before we talk about anything else." She looked at him then, fully, for the first time all evening. Not the practiced, composed glance she'd given 200 wedding guests, but something raw and searching, like she was checking whether he meant it. "My uncle told me to make sure it was, properly settled," Mateo said, choosing the words carefully, watching her flinch slightly, even at the implication. "For the old men's benefit, I'm telling you now, in this room, that I don't actually care what the old men need to believe. I care what's true. And right now what's true is that you're sitting across from me, shaking, like you've for something terrible, and I'd like to know why. Because I don't think it's simply that you've never met me before tonight." The silence stretched long enough that the distant hum of the city traffic became audible, through the windows. When Sophia finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its careful control. "You're right," she said. "It's not just that I've never met you." "Then tell me." "I don't know how to," she said, and for the first time, something cracked all the way through the composure, not tears yet, but close, the particular fragile honesty of someone admitting a truth they'd never said out loud before. "I don't know how to explain 22 years to a stranger in a hotel room on my wedding night. Mateo, I don't even know where it would start." "Start anywhere," Mateo said. "I'm not going anywhere tonight, except wherever this conversation takes us." "My father has never let me do anything alone," Sophia said. "Not once, in 22 years. Mateo said nothing, the particular patient nothing he'd learned, over years of negotiations, got him further than any question could. Private tutors instead of school, because school meant being somewhere he couldn't control who I talked to. No friends, outside families he'd vetted personally. No job, no university, no apartment of my own. Every single decision of my entire life made by someone who decided, the day I was born, that I was the most valuable thing his family had to protect, and that protecting me meant making sure I never had to make a real decision on my own." Her hands tightened in her lap. "I used to think it was love. I think now it might have just been fear, dressed up as love. He was so afraid of losing me, or of me becoming a liability, or a target. He never let me become anything except careful, sheltered, useful. Eventually, for exactly the thing that happened tonight. He raised you to be a treaty," Mateo said quietly. "He raised me to be valuable enough that handing me over would actually mean something." Sophia's voice cracked on the last word. The first real break in 22 years of practiced composure. "I have never been on a date. I have never had a job, even a small one. I have never once made a decision about my own life that mattered. Because every decision that mattered was already made for me, for my protection, my whole life. And tonight is the first time anyone has ever told me I was finally being useful for something. And the something is this. Mateo sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift in his chest that he didn't immediately have a name for. He thought of his own father, who'd treated marriage exactly the way Salvatore still did. A transaction, a box to check. A woman's only relevant value being whatever she could be traded for. He'd never questioned that model, because he'd never been shown another one. He was looking, now, at the human cost of it sitting 3 feet away from him in a wedding dress that looked, the longer he looked at it, less like a garment, and more like exactly the cage she'd just described. Nothing has to happen tonight, he said finally. Nothing has to happen this week, or this month, or for as long as it takes you to decide what you actually want, separate from what anyone else has ever told you to want. Sophia looked at him, startled. My father expects. I don't particularly care what either of our fathers expect from this room tonight. Mateo's voice stayed level, certain. The treaty doesn't require anyone's testimony about what happens between us in private, Sophia. It requires a marriage on paper and 2 families that stop killing each other's sons. I can give the old men whatever impression they need without you having to do a single thing you'd not ready for. You'd lie for me. I'd lie for the truth, which is that nothing happening here tonight is anyone's business but ours. He held her gaze, steady. I'm not interested in claiming a frightened stranger to satisfy my uncle's idea of what a husband is supposed to do on his wedding night. I've spent my whole life watching men in my family treat marriage like a business deal, closed in a bedroom. I don't want that. I didn't know I didn't want that until about 10 minutes ago, watching you shake on that chair. But I'm certain of it now. For the first time all evening, something in Sophia's shoulders eased. Not fully, not all at once, but enough that Mateo could see the difference. What happens now then? She asked. Now you take off those shoes that are clearly killing your feet. We order something from room service that isn't wedding cake, and we get to know each other like 2 people who are actually going to be married for the rest of their lives, instead of 2 strangers performing a transaction for an audience that isn't even in the room. A small, surprised sound escaped her. Not quite a laugh, but close. The first unguarded thing she'd done all night. That's not what either of our fathers had in mind. No, Mateo agreed. It's what I have in mind. I'd like to find out if it's something you might want too, once you're not terrified out of your mind. The weeks that followed reshaped something in both of them, slowly, in small pieces, neither fully noticed accumulating until they looked back and realized how much had changed. He taught her things about his world, not the dangerous operational details that would only frighten her further, but the practical architecture of it, who mattered, and why. How to read a room full of men who'd spent decades learning to hide what they actually meant. She picked it up faster than he expected, asking sharp, precise questions that made him reconsider how much her father's sheltering had actually limited her mind versus simply limited her opportunities to use it. You're better at reading people than half my captains, he told her one evening, 3 weeks in, after she'd correctly identified which of his associates at a dinner had been quietly lying about supply numbers before Mateo himself had caught it. I had a lot of practice reading rooms I wasn't allowed to participate in, Sophia said, with the dry, exhausted humor of someone who'd turned a painful skill into something almost useful. Watching from the edges teaches you things, eventually. She started asking him real questions too, not the performed wifely interest his uncles expected, but genuine curiosity, the kind nobody had bothered with in years. What he'd wanted to be before this life had claimed him entirely, whether he resented his father for it, what he actually thought, privately, about the treaty, separate from what was good for business. Nobody's asked me a real question about myself in longer than I can remember, he admitted one night, surprised by his own honesty. Everyone wants something from me. You're the first person in years who seems to just want to know. I spent 22 years being asked nothing at all, Sophia said. I think I overcorrected. Don't apologize for it. Salvatore noticed the shift before either of them fully named it themselves, and didn't approve. "You're soft with her," his uncle said bluntly, 3 weeks after the wedding, cornering Matteo in his study. "The men are starting to talk. Husband, who lets his wife ask questions, who doesn't handle things the way a man in your position should. It looks weak, Matteo. It looks like I respect my wife," Matteo said, not looking up from the papers on his desk. "If that reads as weakness to you, that's a problem with how you define strength, not a problem with my marriage. The old men expect an heir eventually. The old men can expect whatever they like." Matteo finally looked up, his voice gone flat and final, the tone Salvatore had learned over decades not to push against. "Sofia decides what she wants from this marriage, on her own timeline, for her own reasons. Nobody else's expectations factor into that decision. Not yours, not the old men's, not even mine, if it comes to it. Are we clear?" Salvatore left, without another word. The particular silence of a man recalibrating his understanding of his nephew's authority. Don Ricci arrived at the Conti estate unannounced, 6 weeks after the wedding, a particular breach of etiquette that immediately told Matteo this wasn't a courtesy visit. He found the old man in the front hall, still in his coat, refusing the housekeeper's offer to take it, his eyes already moving across the entryway, with the assessing, suspicious sweep of a father checking for damage. "Don Ricci." Matteo crossed the hall, hand extended. "We weren't expecting you." "No," the old man agreed, shaking his hand briefly, his grip firm despite his age. "I imagine you weren't. I'd like to see my daughter, Matteo, alone, if you don't object." "Of course." Matteo kept his voice even, though something in the old man's tone had already set off a low, familiar alarm. "She's in the East Garden. I'll have someone bring you through. I know the way. I've been to enough of these estates over the years to find a garden without an escort." He found his own way there, and found Sofia exactly where Matteo had said she'd be, sitting on a stone bench with a book open on her lap that she hadn't been reading, the late afternoon light catching the loose strands of hair she no longer pinned into the elaborate, painful structures her father's household had always required. "Papa," she rose quickly, surprise and something more complicated crossing her face. "I didn't know you were coming. Didn't tell anyone I was coming." Don Ricci studied her for a long moment, the same assessing sweep he'd given the entryway, except now it was his daughter under inspection. "You look different." "Different how?" "I'm not certain yet." He sat down on the bench, gesturing for her to join him, and waited until she had, before continuing. "There are rumors reaching me, Sofia, from men who talk to Salvatore Conti, rumors that this marriage isn't what it's supposed to be, that Matteo hasn't, that the treaty hasn't been properly settled, even after 6 weeks. Sofia's spine straightened, something steadier in her than the version of herself who would have, 6 weeks ago, simply absorbed her father's concern without comment. "The treaty is settled, Papa. Both families have stopped fighting. Territory disputes are being resolved through arbitration instead of bloodshed. Isn't that the entire point of what you arranged?" The point was also to ensure the alliance was binding, permanent, not something either side could walk away from once it became inconvenient. Don Ricci's voice carried the particular weary patience of a man explaining something he considered obvious. "An unconsummated marriage is not binding in the eyes of the old families, Sofia. It's a formality on paper that anyone could dissolve if circumstances changed." "Is that genuinely what concerns you?" Sofia asked, and something in her voice had an edge her father had clearly never heard from her before, because his eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. "Or are you concerned that Matteo hasn't claimed me the way you expected him to, and you're reading that as a slight against my value, rather than considering that maybe I asked for time and he gave it to me?" Don Ricci was quiet for a moment, recalibrating. "You asked for time. I was terrified, Papa. On my wedding night, in a hotel room with a stranger, after 22 years of never once being allowed to make a decision for myself. I was shaking so hard I could barely hold a champagne glass at my own reception. Did anyone tell you that? Did anyone mention that your daughter spent the entire wedding day in a state of genuine panic, Because the first time anyone had ever discussed my future with me, I was being informed of it, not asked about it. I protected you, her father said, and for the first time, something defensive entered his voice. Everything I did, every decision I made on your behalf, was to keep you safe. I know that. Sophia's voice softened, though it didn't lose its new steadiness. I know you believe that, Papa. I've spent 6 weeks trying to understand the difference between what you believed you were doing and what it actually felt like from where I was standing. You kept me safe by keeping me small and making sure I never had to think for myself, never had to risk anything, never had to be anything except valuable enough to eventually hand over to someone else. That's not. Don Ricci stopped himself. The practiced denial, dying before it fully formed. Something in his daughter's directness, clearly landing somewhere he hadn't expected it to. I never meant for it to feel that way. I believe you. I also need you to hear that it did. Sophia reached over and took her father's hand, the gesture gentler than her words had been, an offering of grace, alongside the honesty. Do you remember when I was 12, and I asked if I could take the train into the city with Mariana's family, just for the day, just to see the museum? I remember. Don Ricci's jaw tightened slightly. I said no. It wasn't safe. You hired a car, and a driver, and 2 men I'd never met, to take me instead, and I spent the entire day terrified of them, rather than enjoying the museum. And afterward, you told me how grateful I should be that you'd found a way to let me go at all. Sophia's voice stayed gentle, but it didn't waver. I was grateful, Papa. I want you to understand that. I genuinely was, for years, because gratitude was the only response I'd ever been taught to have. It took me leaving your house to understand that gratitude and freedom aren't actually the same thing, even when they're standing right next to each other. Don Ricci said nothing for a long moment, his hand going still beneath hers. Matteo asked me what I wanted, Papa. On our wedding night, and every week since. Nobody has ever asked me that before in my entire life. I needed time to even know how to answer the question, because I'd never once been given the chance to practice having an opinion that mattered. And now? The old man asked quietly. Do you have an answer now? Sophia thought of the gala 3 weeks earlier, of her own hand finding Matteo's without him reaching first, of the quiet, growing certainty that had been building in her ever since. I'm getting there, on my own timeline. Not yours, and not the old men's, and not even Matteo's, though he's been patient enough not to push for one. Matteo found Don Ricci in the study an hour later, the old man having declined dinner, sitting instead with a glass of untouched wine, staring at nothing in particular. She spoke to you plainly, Matteo said, settling into the chair across from him. I gather it wasn't entirely comfortable. No, Don Ricci admitted. It wasn't. He turned the wine glass slowly by its stem, not drinking. I came here today, prepared to tell you that you were failing to honor the treaty properly. That a marriage unconsummated, after 6 weeks, was an insult to my family, regardless of what excuses you offered for it. Now I'm sitting in your study, wondering how many other things I got wrong, raising her. The old man's voice had gone rough. Unguarded in a way Matteo suspected very few people had ever witnessed. I built my entire understanding of fatherhood around protection, Matteo, around control. I told myself that was love, because I genuinely believed it was the only kind of love I knew how to offer a daughter in this world. She just told me, very calmly, very directly, that it felt like something else entirely. I'm not going to pretend I have the answer to that, Matteo said carefully. I'm only 6 weeks into figuring out how to do this differently myself. Differently than your father did it. Differently than every man in either of our families has ever done it. Matteo met the old man's eyes steadily. I'm not interested in claiming her the way I was raised to believe a husband should. I'm interested in actually knowing her, and letting her actually know me, and seeing what we build together once neither of us is performing for an audience of old men who've never questioned their own assumptions. Don Ricci was quiet for a long moment. The men will talk regardless. An unconventional marriage invites scrutiny, Matteo. Salvatore isn't wrong about that, even if his solution to it is wrong. Let them talk. Mateo's voice held the same flat finality he'd used with his uncle weeks earlier. I'm not building this marriage for the satisfaction of men who think respect is a weakness. I'm building it for Sophia, and for whatever life we actually choose together. If that takes longer than 6 weeks to satisfy the old guard's expectations, it takes longer. The old man studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes. Not full agreement, not yet, but the beginning of something closer to it. She chose well, he said finally, quietly, almost to himself. Or got lucky. I'm not yet certain which. Both, possibly, Mateo said. I'd like to think both. Don Ricci left the following morning, the visit shorter than he'd originally planned. But something in his departure felt different from his arrival. Less suspicious, more uncertain, in a way that Mateo recognized as the early, uncomfortable shape of an old man reconsidering decades of assumptions he'd never thought to question. He didn't apologize to his daughter before he left. That kind of reckoning, Mateo suspected, would take considerably longer than one afternoon in a garden. But he held her a moment longer than usual at the door, and said, low enough that only she could hear it, tell me, when you're ready, whatever you decide about this marriage, about this life. I'd like to actually hear it from you, instead of assuming I already know. It wasn't an apology. It was, Sophia understood, watching her father's car disappear down the long drive, first real opening toward one. And it was more than she'd ever expected to get. It was Sophia, 2 weeks after that conversation, which Mateo hadn't mentioned to her, not wanting her to feel like a battle had been fought over her, who closed the last real distance between them in a small, unremarkable moment that mattered more than either of them expected. They were at a charity gala, one of the few public events where both families' new alliance was meant to be visibly performed for the wider world. Sophia had grown more confident in these rooms over the weeks, but the size of the crowd that night had her nerves fraying at the edges anyway, her composed, public mask working overtime against something Mateo could see flickering underneath it. Without quite deciding to, without him reaching for her first, she slipped her hand into his. It was such a small thing, it shouldn't have mattered the way it did. But Mateo felt it land somewhere significant, the simple, unprompted choice of a woman who had spent 22 years never choosing contact, never choosing anything, finally reaching for something, for him, because she wanted to, not because anyone had told her to. He laced his fingers through hers and said nothing, letting the gesture be exactly as quiet and ordinary as she'd made it. Understanding, without being told, that drawing attention to it would undo whatever fragile, important thing had just happened. It was Don Ricci, of all people, who called the estate the morning after the attack at the charity luncheon, his voice tight, with a fear Mateo had never once heard from the composed, controlled old man in any of their previous dealings. She's safe? No greeting, no preamble, just the raw question of a father who had clearly heard second-hand reports before official confirmation reached him. She's safe, Mateo said, shaken, but unhurt. She's the reason she's unhurt, actually. She spotted the threat before my own security did. There was a long pause on the line. She saw it coming. She did. 2 months of paying attention to rooms, instead of just performing composure in them. Mateo found himself, unexpectedly, almost proud relaying it, the way he imagined a father might be. I'd like you to hear that directly from her, if she's willing. It might mean more coming from her than from me. Don Ricci arrived again within the day, faster this time, less guarded, and found his daughter in the same garden as before, though steadier now than she'd been even during their last difficult conversation. I heard, he said, sitting beside her, without being invited this time, an old man's quiet assumption of welcome, that Sophia, this time, didn't mind. I heard you saw the danger before anyone else did. I did. She didn't dress it up, didn't perform false modesty the way the old version of her might have, simply stated it as fact. 2 months ago, I wouldn't have trusted my own judgment enough to say anything. Even if I'd noticed something wrong, I would have assumed I was being paranoid, or dramatic, or simply wrong, because I'd never once been given evidence that my own instincts were worth trusting. And now I have evidence. Something steady and clear moved across her face, the particular quiet pride of someone who had finally been allowed to discover her own competence, rather than having it permanently withheld from her. I trusted myself, Papa, for the first time in my life, in a moment that actually mattered, and it turned out I was right. Don Ricci was silent for a long moment, watching his daughter with an expression Sophia had rarely seen on him. Not the careful, protective assessment she'd grown up under, but something closer to genuine wonder, the look of a man finally seeing his child clearly for the first time. I spent 22 years making every decision for you, because I was terrified something would happen to you that I couldn't prevent, he said finally, his voice rough. I told myself that was the only way to keep you safe. I never once considered that it might also be keeping you small, that the very thing I was so afraid of, losing you, watching you face danger unprepared, might actually be more likely, not less, in a version of you who'd never been allowed to trust her own judgment about anything. You're allowed to have been wrong, Papa, Sophia said gently. I think most people raising children are wrong about something. I think the only real failure would be refusing to see it, once it's right in front of you. I see it, Don Ricci said quietly. I see it now. He reached over, the same gesture he'd made at their wedding, his hand brushing her cheek. Except this time, it didn't feel like a goodbye to something he was about to lose. It felt, Sophia realized, like a father meeting his daughter for the first time as the person she'd actually become, rather than the asset he'd always assumed she'd remain. I'm proud of you, not for the marriage, not for the treaty, not for any of the things I used to measure your worth by. I'm proud of the woman sitting in front of me, who trusted her own eyes when it mattered, and was right to. It wasn't the apology Matteo suspected would take considerably longer to fully arrive. It was real, and it was enough, and Sophia found herself, for the first time in her entire life, simply allowing herself to receive her father's Selen, without immediately wondering what it would cost her later. Some things, she was learning, slowly. 2 months, and one terrifying afternoon, into an entirely unexpected life, really were freely given, asking nothing in return at all. Enzo Bartoli had built his entire career on the war the treaty was meant to end. For 11 years, he'd feed-run smuggling routes through the contested territory between the Conti and Ricci families, profiting handsomely from a conflict that kept both sides too distracted to notice exactly how much was passing through his hands unaccounted for. The peace Matteo had brokered didn't just end a war. It ended Enzo's livelihood, his relevance, and very possibly his freedom. Once the unified families started auditing territory they'd spent a decade too busy fighting over to properly examine. He had no intention of letting that happen quietly. It was 8 weeks after the wedding when it came to a head. A charity luncheon at a hotel, downtown. Sophia, attending alongside several of the Conti families, wives and daughters, while Matteo handled business across town. A routine public appearance that had become almost comfortable in the 2 months since the wedding had stopped feeling like a performance and started feeling, slowly, like an actual life. Sophia noticed the man near the service entrance before anyone else did. It wasn't dramatic. It was small. The same kind of small wrongness she'd learned over weeks of Matteo quietly teaching her to read rooms the way his world required, and never dismiss. A waiter who didn't move like the other waiters, who kept glancing toward the head table rather than toward the kitchen, who had positioned himself near an exit rather than near the food. She didn't freeze. She didn't second-guess herself the way the old version of her, the one raised to never trust her own judgment about anything, might have. She leaned toward Gianna's counterpart on the Conti security detail, a quiet, older woman named Renata, who'd been assigned to her since the wedding, and said, low and steady, the man by the service door. He doesn't belong here. Something's wrong. Renata's eyes flicked over, assessed, and confirmed it in under 3 seconds. Years of training catching what Sophia's 2 months of careful attention had also caught. Get up. Slowly, we're leaving through the side hall. Now. It happened fast after that. The man at the service door moved the instant he realized he'd been made, reaching for something beneath his jacket, and Renata had Sophia moving before he cleared the weapon. hustling her through a side door into a service corridor while shouting into her radio. Gunfire erupted behind them, short and sharp, security responding before the threat got anywhere close to the room full of guests. By the time Mateo arrived, breaking every speed law across the city, the instant Renata's alert hit his phone, the situation was already contained. One gunman dead, the second apprehended attempting to flee through the kitchen, both confirmed within the hour, as Bartoli associates, hired specifically to eliminate Sofia and collapse the treaty along with her. I found her in a side office, pale but steady, sitting upright in a chair, with Renata standing guard at the door, looking less like a victim and more like someone who had just successfully executed something she'd quietly preparing for without fully realizing it. You saw him before Renata did, Mateo said, crossing the room, dropping to his knees in front of her chair, checking her over with hands that weren't quite steady despite his best efforts at composure. You're the reason you're sitting here right now, not just her training. You noticed. I've spent 2 months learning how to actually look at a room instead of just performing. Composure in one, Sofia said, and her voice, though tired, held something new in it, a quiet, surprised pride at her own competence. The first time in her entire life, she'd had real evidence that her own judgment could be trusted with something that mattered. I didn't even think about it as fear, Mateo. I just saw something wrong, and I said something. That's not nothing. That's everything. He reached up, gently, asking permission, with the gesture before completing it, and when she didn't flinch away, cupped her face in both hands. You did that, not because anyone told you to, because you've spent 2 months becoming someone who trusts her own eyes. Enzo Bartoli was found 3 days later, in a warehouse, on the edge of the contested territory. He'd spent 11 years quietly bleeding for profit. The details of his arrest and subsequent removal from both families, concerns, handled with the brutal, efficient finality the old world required, and Mateo, no longer had any interest in apologizing for. The treaty held. Peace, for the first time in over a decade, stood on ground that felt solid rather than merely paper-thin. It was late that evening when Mateo found Sofia on the terrace of the estate, looking out over the grounds, in the soft, dark, same restless watchfulness from their wedding night, now tempered into something calmer, more settled. I keep thinking about that first night, she said, without turning around, as he came to stand beside her. How terrified I was, how certain I was, that the only thing I had to offer anyone was being handed over successfully. You were wrong about that, Mateo said quietly. I know that now. She finally turned to face him, something steady and clear in her expression that hadn't been there 2 months ago, that he suspected hadn't been there at any point in her entire sheltered, carefully controlled life before this one. I used to think this marriage was the only thing I'd ever be given that mattered. I think now, it might be the first thing I actually chose, somewhere along the way, without anyone telling me to. I stopped thinking of this as a treaty I was honoring weeks ago, Mateo admitted, the words coming slower, more carefully than he was used to speaking. I started thinking of it as a life I actually wanted, not the one our fathers arranged, the one we've actually built, these past 2 months, in the space between what was expected of us and what we decided to make of it instead. Is that a question? It's an honest accounting. He took her hand, the same gesture she'd offered him first at the gala weeks ago, now returned, equal, chosen by both of them, rather than performed for anyone watching. But I'd like to ask you something real, if you're ready to hear it. Not because any treaty requires an answer, because I actually want to know. Sofia waited, steady, present, nothing like the shaking, terrified bride from that first night. Do you want this? Mateo asked simply. Not the marriage our fathers arranged, not the peace it bought our families. Just this. Me. Whatever we're building here, on our own terms, at our own pace. Do you want it? Separate from anything anyone else has ever decided for you. Sofia didn't answer right away. She took the time the question deserved, the way she'd learned, over 2 months, of finally being allowed to think for herself, that real choices were worth taking seriously. Yes, she said finally, Simply, the same unhurried certainty he'd come to recognize as entirely, genuinely hers. I want this. I want you. Not because anyone arranged it, because somewhere in the last 2 months, I actually chose it. It wasn't a grand declaration. It didn't need to be. It was simply the truth, finally spoken aloud by a woman who had spent 22 years never once being asked what she wanted, answering, for the first time in her life, a question that was actually entirely hers to answer. Matteo Conti had been raised to believe marriage was a transaction closed in a bedroom, a box checked for the benefit of old men who'd never questioned the model themselves. It took a terrified 22-year-old stranger, shaking in a wedding dress that looked more like a cage than a gown, to teach him that real peace, the kind that actually lasted, the kind worth building a life around, was never something you took. It was something you waited for, patiently, honestly, until it was freely given. That's not weakness. In a world built on power and old expectations, it's the rarest, hardest won kind of strength there is. If this story moved you, smash that like button. Subscribe for more stories where respect turns out to be the most powerful thing a person can offer. And tell me in the comments, what was the moment you knew Matteo had truly changed? See you in the next one.